So I'm going to be talking about accessibility today. The name of the presentation is Out of Sight, Out of Mind, because puns are fantastic. So when you don't think about accessibility, your site will end up lacking it. So it needs to be at the forefront of your mind. So it ends up in the site. We're going to go over what accessibility is, why it's important as designers and why we should care about it, how it relates to the tech industry, and then go through how we can design for accessibility, building it into our design process, as well as different patterns for accessibility. And we'll end with some resources that I found helpful during my time as a designer. So a little bit about me. I am an associate product designer right now for WebMD Health Services down in Portland, Oregon, or over, depending on where you're at. And I've been there for just about a year. And in this role, I've done a lot of research, UX, and UI. As a product designer, you're in charge of taking a product from the start of the design process all the way through the end. So if you're not familiar with the UX industry, there's a lot of different roles, as in specifically for UX researchers, UI designers, specific UX designers who work on more of the user experience and not the UI. And then I, as a product designer, just kind of do a little bit of everything. So part of my responsibilities, I oversee our team's design system and manage that. I help with data analysis from the quantitative user testing that we do. And then I've led the design for a secure product sign-in, and I'm currently leading the design for some new features that I can't talk about because we're recording. So yeah. To start with, what is accessibility? Just to kind of gauge what kind of audience we have, if anybody wants to kind of throw that in the chat, what their thoughts on accessibility are, that would be great. And then I will find my chat, hopefully. I don't know where it's at.
Sita is saying designing technologies for disabilities. That's one answer. Anyone else?
Anybody else? All right. Well, that one is really, it's a pretty good description, I would say, of what accessibility is. I like to break it down into kind of three aspects where accessibility is the ability to understand, access, and complete a specific task when facing unique limitations. So it doesn't necessarily have to apply to disabilities, but that is one of the more common limitations that does come to mind. So when I'm designing, I try to keep these three key pieces in mind, regardless of the user that I'm designing for. So if it's understandable, that means they understand how to use it and the purpose of the product. Available, they are able to access it, and then usually it's usable. When those two things are true, most of the time it's usable, but there's a select few cases where it may not be. So a couple examples of this is a sidewalk that has a 90-degree angled curve on it. It's understandable for a person who is in a wheelchair. They understand that this is where pedestrians are supposed to be on a road, but it's not available to them because they can't get up that curb in their wheelchair. So it's not usable for them. So the sidewalk is not accessible. So to fix this, designers have been able to use a sloped incline to get onto the sidewalk. So now it's understandable, available, and usable to the person. Another example is a wordy sign. This example is one of my favorites because It's from Palouse Falls in Washington. And these are warning signs about the cliffs that are around the falls, because they're pretty dangerous because there's no railings. And it's very wordy. And for someone who doesn't speak English, this sign, it's available, it's right in front of them, but it may not be understandable, and so it's not usable. So to solve this problem, you can design with multiple languages. So this sign has 2 languages, a visual picture, and contrasting colors so that you can notice it better than just a red wordy sign. So this is more accessible than the first sign because there's more users who can use it. And then the last example is something that is available, understandable, but it's not quite usable. You might recognize this example from The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, where the signifier of the door, the flat horizontal bar on the front, indicates that you should push the left door to open it, but the sign is saying to pull it. So it's available right in front of us. We understand that the door needs to open for us to be able to use it, but it's not usable because we can't get past that signifier. So to fix this, use proper signifiers for your products. So technically these examples aren't perfect. You can argue that yes, the sidewalk is usable to the everyday person, and that could be your target user. Technically that the sign is legible to most people living in the US, and we can get around the annoyance of a door with an improper signifier. But 26% of adults in the US have some type of disability according to the CDC. So to ignore a population like that would be to ignore 1 in 4 people in the US. The CDC further breaks down adults with functional disabilities into 13.7% having mobility disabilities, and then 10.8% with cognitive disabilities. And you can see how this chart kind of breaks that down further. And so you can see that this is really important, that if we ignore this population, we would be excluding a large portion of our users. And so this is valuable because we can see that solving for one can extend the solution to many. For example, the sloped curb, that example from the beginning, we solved that problem by, or excuse me, the sharp curve from the beginning, we solved that problem by implementing a sloped curve. And this can extend to more users than just somebody in there. How useful could that be for children riding bicycles? Or the second example, the visuals, how useful could that be for someone on their phone that maybe they speak English, but they wouldn't have noticed the super wordy sign? The higher contrast of the colors might call their attention out better. And then with the door, hopefully you can see the usefulness of signifiers aligning with the function of a product. We barely even notice it. So how does this apply to tech? So far we've kind of discussed accessibility in the physical world. With products that don't consider accessibility, they will limit a user's ability to access information, education, and all the other benefits of the internet. So, or internet and I guess the digital space, as they provide social connectedness, mental health resources, entertainment, and other delightful experiences. So without these, users could result in having issues with making uninformed decisions, difficulty to grow and enhance your inner self, and poor mental health because they're not able to access and use the same resources that other users use. Now that was the kind of ethical side of designing for accessibility. The other side is kind of the more business. Designing for accessibility in the digital space is the law in most places. Specific to the US, the Rehabilitation Act of 1998 and the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, that's a mouthful, of 2010, basically make it so that public digital spaces should be just as accessible as the public physical spaces. So this gives somebody that has a disability the right to have access to these spaces with as much, sorry, my brain is, with as much access as a typical person that doesn't have those limitations. And then the other side of this, again, with that 1 in 4 people in the US are impacted by disabilities. If you ignore that population, you're missing out on the potential profits for designing for them, because if you're not going to do it, somebody else most likely will. So coming to accessibility in the design process. So typically when we design for our users, and we create user personas, and we think about their limitations, the user's needs, characteristics. So when we do that, it's a good idea to look at who our extreme users are, what are their limitations and needs. So if you're not familiar with what an extreme user is, this is a term that was first used in the Interaction, Relabeling, and Extreme Characters book, and then it was adopted by the user-centered design community and popularized by the Stanford Design School. Basically, this is a picture of a usability or a curve of all the users using a product. So in the center, you have kind of your average users, and on the ends, you have the 2 extremes. So on the far right, you have users who use the product really well or a lot of the time. And on the left, you have users who might struggle using the product or don't use it very often. So we can take this and apply it to accessibility for users who may have more difficulty using your product. So some common extreme user limitations when it comes to accessibility are mobility, visual limitations, audible limitations, verbal, and then cognitive and neurological. And these 5 categories cover most of the limitations that we should consider as designers to make our products more accessible. And these are used by the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative while they draft the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And if you're not familiar with what those are, the Web Accessibility Initiative is part of the World Wide Web Consortium, lots of W's. And they developed the international web standards. And they launched the Web Accessibility Initiative to be more inclusive with design standards. And they draft the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. And those are then adopted by most of the most government agencies as well as businesses throughout the world use those as their basis for the guidelines to use when they're designing. So back to this idea for designing one and extending to many. We can design for a permanent limitation from one of those 5 categories, and then we can extend that limitation to, or extend that solution to temporary and situational limitations. And we'll go through now each of the 5 categories and talk about different limitations for each of those three possibilities. So for mobility, a permanent limitation could look like poor coordination, having arthritis, or severe paralysis. So that affects your ability to navigate a computer, whether that's with a mouse, or you can't even move at all. And so then you need to use like eye tracking or voice to navigate your device. In a similar fashion, a temporary limitation that a solution for a mobility limitation could extend to a broken arm, a sprained wrist, and then a situational limitation is one that's temporary but more based on your situation. So like carrying boxes or navigating a large crowd where you don't have that same mobility as you would if you were alone. And then visual limitations, permanent blindness, even partial blindness, color blindness are all more permanent. And then a temporary limitation could look like misplacing your glasses or forgetting to put in your contacts, having a low device battery that causes your screen to dim, or a situational would be a glaring sun or in a dark room where your visibility is limited. And I think the visual and mobile categories are the ones that we think of most of the time when we think of accessibility, but the other ones are just as important. So for audible limitations, permanent could be complete loss of hearing or partial loss of hearing. Temporary is ears ringing at an event, or if you're listening to loud music on a separate device, so you're not going to hear the notifications that might come through on your other one. Or if your device is on mute, you wouldn't hear any of that. Situational could be you're at a loud event, so you can't hear your device, or you're in a quiet space like a library where it's not socially acceptable to have your device be making loud noise. Verbal, so permanent loss of speech, partial loss of speech, or like stuttering or slurring. Temporary could be recovering after a cold, so you've lost your voice. And then situational, loud event or in a quiet space again. And then cognitive and neurological. I think this category is one of the more interesting ones, as it really affects like your understanding of a product. So if these needs and limitations aren't considered from the design, when you're designing, you're rarely going to be able to get to the next the available piece or the usability piece. So examples of this could be permanent is learning disabilities, Alzheimer's, or even seizures, since a lot of seizures are caused by neurological limitations. And then temporary could be headaches, dizziness, or even like a literacy level for more cognitive temporary. And then situational could be any kind of event that happens that causes a spike in adrenaline, or you to be extremely distracted from a different task at hand. So emergency situation or multitasking, which causes stress and distraction. So now that we've kind of like looked at the different limitations, we'll go through some design solutions to help users with these limitations navigate your products better. So in general, these 5 tips are applied to all 5 of the categories that we just discussed. So providing options, being able to provide a user options to customize the screen. So increasing font size or decreasing font size, changing between light mode or dark mode, allowing other customizations like turning up the volume on like a video player, And then use multiple indicators. This one applies a lot to like text links because you're going to want to provide at least 2 visual indicators for those, but it also applies to things like alerts. If you're not if you're doing an audible alert, you're going to also want to do something that's visual as well, and vice versa. And then clear organization of your page helps any user navigate your product, but especially when someone's navigating it with external tools, that organization becomes even more important as they're tabbing through the page. And then similarly, the direct labels and actions, those are going to help users understand exactly what a specific button does, or what they're going to need to do to interact with your page. And where that comes in probably most often is with readers and users who are navigating with keyboard navigation. So that visual limitation where you're tabbing through the page and listening to the screen reader read through everything. So if something's labeled improperly, they're not going to know how to interact with the page. So some more specific mobility solutions. There's newer technology where you can navigate your computer through eye tracking. And then there's also the ways of navigating through verbal input. So as designers, to kind of support these, you want to make sure you're designing a clear focus state that has enough visibility on the page that the user knows where they're at as they're navigating the interface, and then make sure your content is in logical order. Like I included that in the 5 tips that's important, so that they can see exactly where they're at and where they want to go next. For visual solutions, there's alternative navigation, like we were just talking about, the keyboard navigation and screen readers, using clear color contrast so users with partial visual limitations can still see the different elements you have on a page. So the current color contrast ratio for normal text size is 4.5, and then for larger text, it's 3. And there's some great resources and tools out there that can help you measure that, which we'll include here at the end of this presentation. And then again, this clear focus state, so it's apparent to the user that where they're at on the page. And so here's a nice example from Google that shows exactly where I was at on the page. And then supporting scalable fonts. And then one that I didn't actually write on this slide is providing alt text for images and other visual elements. So again, that screen reader can read through and the user has a clear picture of the content that is on the page. So audible solutions, supporting captions and transcripts for video players and other content like slide decks that are on the site. Audio customization options. You can see in this video player here, the user has the option to do both captions and transcripts, as well as speed it up, slow it down, and there's even more settings there. And then don't rely just on the sound alerts or audible feedback. You'll want to do more than one indicator, like we were talking about earlier. And then exploring the use of haptic feedback, I think, is a great opportunity here, as it can get around that audible limitation through vibrations and other haptic senses. So verbal limitations, don't just rely on verbal inputs. This is most common in the digital assistants, being able to say, you know, okay Google, or hey Siri, asking a question. So to provide a solution for that, make sure your product can support quick actions and gestures that can be customized to what the user is wanting to execute. And then for cognitive and neurological solutions, make sure you're using simple and clear language. Avoid flashy animations that could disjoint the user. Don't use vibrating colors. Again, this goes along with kind of the color contrast, but vibrating specifically can cause poor neurological reactions. And then support features like Remember Me and saving a user's information, like autofilling forms. That way, someone with like Alzheimer's doesn't have to rely on their own limited abilities to use your product. So most of these limitations and solutions you can apply in your design system, or you can apply the solutions in your design system and then use those elements throughout your product, and not have to continuously keep solving for the same problem. So we'll talk a little bit now about how to kind of set that up and work with other teams to make sure it's implemented across your product. So to begin with, I recommend getting some general documentation together, getting a team of, typically I would say at least one developer, someone from the business side of things, a quality assurance person, and then at least one designer. And that kind of forms your representation from each of the teams that work on your product. And then having that as a core accessibility team, so you have representation from each kind of department to make these decisions. And then Atomic Design is a great resource out there for design systems, and there's some more detailed info there that you can dig into. So yeah, once you have your team together, you kind of want to discuss and decide what guidelines you want to follow with accessibility. The current standard right now is the WCAG 2.0. And then the patterns for understanding, supporting understanding, is to define your content voice and what literacy levels that you want to support throughout your product. And so getting your team together, documenting that so everyone's on the same page, and so throughout the whole design process, you can be in agreement that this is how your product should be. Bring hierarchy to your design with standardizing page layouts. Again, that consistency across your product is going to go a long way for all users, but again, specifically with accessibility, using that consistent labeling that we talked about and having proper headings so users know what to expect. Define the paragraph line length. Typically, the standard would be about 600 pixels for a max width. And then anything longer than that, for any user, it's going to strain their eyes even more so when it comes to accessibility. And then define the proper usage for each element. This again reinforces that consistency throughout your product, so that if you use an expansion panel in one section in a certain way, you're not reusing it for a completely different purpose somewhere else. And then patterns for availability. Again, we talked about focus state, but it's in here again because it's pretty important. So define the different styling, UI styling for your focus states. And then make sure it follows the labeling in your product, follows the same visual hierarchy that you've designed. So your focus state isn't going from the top of the page to the center of the page, back up to the top of the page, and making sure everybody's in agreement with how that should should be set out from each of the departments is key to keeping your product accessible, because you can always design it one way, and then once it goes into development, if there's no one agreeing to keep accessibility throughout your product, you're going to run into issues. Aria labels are great when you don't have, or like when you want to include like an icon button on a page. You need to make sure that that is labeled correctly so that screen readers can still convey that functionality to someone navigating with a keyboard and screen reader. So documenting in your design system how that should be labeled, different or clear labels will really help. So if you have like a little trash icon, like in an email application, labeling that as delete or something clear instead of just trash. And then define your high visibility focus state. I think I said that already. I think the first one was just on the flow though. So we covered that. And then usability patterns. So defining colors, making sure that there's accessible contrast throughout all the colors you use in your product. If you do this at the design system level, when you go to design a full page layout, you don't have to worry about checking the contrast constantly while you're designing. You can just pick a color that you've already checked the contrast with and use it in your layout. Define, and the important thing with that too is for like disabled button states, a lot of times I've found on sites that I've reviewed, the disabled state of the button isn't accessible, but the normal enabled state is. And so paying attention to each component state is really important, because if that disabled state isn't accessible, you're not going to be able, the user's not going to know that it exists on the page, and they're not going to know that they need to interact with the page to make it enabled. And then we talked a little bit about doing 2 visual indicators for links. So typically that's color and font weight, or color and underlining the text. And then using that consistently across the site. So don't have a link that's blue in one spot and then bright pink in another spot. Use the colors that you defined already in your design system to style your links and keep that consistent. We talked a little bit already about labeling icon buttons, and then provide a way to skip to the main content or section of the page. If you have time, I recommend looking at this on the Google search is probably the easiest. But if you tab through a Google search, you'll see there's 3 options at the top where it says jump to search results or jump to footer. And then if you just keep tabbing through them, it'll tab down the page in normal order. But providing this kind of hidden navigation really helps for users navigating, not using the traditional mouse and keyboard. That way they don't have to go through every single option that's at the top of the page. They can easily jump to the next section. And so now we'll go through a couple resources that I have documented and that I use pretty regularly in my life. So some plugins and tools that I found useful. Stark is a color contrast checker. You might already be familiar with it, but they do support, I believe, all of the major design tools, so Sketch, Figma, and Adobe XD. And then I also like Daltonism. This is a application that you can install. I know it exists for Mac. I'm not sure about Windows, but I like it because it's a separate window that you can just pull right over whatever program or web page you're on. So it's not constrained to just Sketch or whatever design tool I'm using. And then WebAim is also a color contrast checker that I use pretty often. It provides, this one's free. Stark has a free version, but I think there's a premium upgrade where you can have more flexibility to get that as close as to accessible as possible by using like a slider. So you can get that with WebAim without having to pay for the upgrade. And then the Able player I found within the last week. So I haven't explored it too much, but that was the screenshot you saw earlier in the presentation. But it's an accessible video player, so you can play around with that to help you think through different features if you're designing for or designing an accessible video player. Or I believe it's a GitHub repository too, so you can talk to whoever is developing your product as well about that. This resource is a persona project I found recently as well. This was developed in the UK, and basically it's a simulation of each of these personas. So you can go to their web page and click on Claudia, a sight impaired screen magnifier user, and it would simulate what she would be seeing as she navigates a site. And then some books and websites that I recommend. I highly recommend Mismatch by Kate Holmes. This goes into more of inclusive design, but it kind of goes hand in hand with accessibility. Highly recommend that if you're looking for some reading. And then W3 Web Accessibility Content Guidelines you can find on W3's site. WebAim has more resources for kind of summarizing the, wow, I put that backward, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, my bad. And then the Alley Project is a community collection of resources, all based around accessibility. And Inclusive Design by Microsoft has some great patterns and design kits for inclusive design as well. I believe we are at the end. Thanks for listening. Template provided by Slides Carnival. It's my first time using them, but I recommend. It was very seamless to integrate. Do I stop sharing now?
Totally. Yay.
Cool.
Thank you.
Hopefully
for that.
I didn't go too fast.
No, it was really good, really insightful. Thank you for your presentation.